Cute. Can you all see my screen okay? And can you see the presentation slide, or are you looking at something else?
Yes, we see the slide. I do.
Thank you, Michael. Much appreciated. All right. And I'm going to get started with this latest talk, starting once again with this lovely graphic by Jonathan. Boy, he does nice work, doesn't he? Even when he's illustrating a frightful concept. So welcome. Thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it. Today's talk is going to be about models and decision making, and more specifically about what flattens a curve. And well, I hope it'll make sense as we go along. But what I'm hoping to do here is get you all to think about something that you already think about, but sort of like what we talked about last time, maybe get you to think about it a little differently. Now, allow me to explain, or try to explain. There we go. So today we're going to talk about three old ideas, the ideas that we talked about last time. The idea of mental models, the idea that every human has three competing processing systems, and the idea that came out of last talk, which is that if you just slow down, think slowly, let that wrinkly tablecloth in the top of your head do the thinking for you, the part that I usually refer to as a brain hack. If you can just do that, then you can be rational about things that otherwise terrify you, right? That put you in those states of irrational thought because of grief or because of stress and anxiety, as we discussed last time. The next thing is to talk about three new ideas. One is a new look, a fresh look at a known model. Another is baking bread. And the final one is responsible teamwork. And if you're wondering how those three things tie together, that's wonderful. That's exactly what I was hoping for. So let's go forward and see what happens. Oh, just a second there. Sorry. There we are. Let's go forward. So the first thing from last week, we are association machines, as I talked about. And everything new we learn, everything new we learn. It'd be nice if we could just grab it wholly and accept it and have new learning, which is what most people think we do, but it's not what we do. Mostly what we do is we try to tie the new information into the mental models that are already in place and the checklists we use to get through life. We try to tie those in, and if there is a mismatch, we assume it's in the new thing, not in the old. That's why the scientific method is the greatest tool ever invented by humans, and other profound statements I can make offhand here that I hope we get to discuss someday in person over a coffee or a beer. The second thing, as I mentioned, is that the human brain has these three competing processors. They'll be the subject of an upcoming talk, and that the fastest processor acts with reflexes, with no thought whatsoever. And the next fastest processor, the one that does most of our thinking for us, does it really emotionally, really quickly, vastly faster than our rational mind, because the rational one is the slowest. And as a result, the rational one has the least effect on what you do moment by moment, unless you choose to change that. I think that's pretty important. And the final thing that came out of last week, or last time, is directly related to that. That's, if you have the time to think, then you're better off thinking with that rational, wrinkly tablecloth brain hat part of your brain. If you have the time to think. If you don't have the time to think, don't worry about it. You've got these beautifully evolved separate processing systems that hopefully will take care of you until you have time to think. So today we have time to think. And I'd like to ask you, as I said, to think a little bit about this. Now, we've all seen this before. This is a famous model that everybody has been using in cartoons, in jokes, and occasionally in scientific talks. But I want to go over it with you because what it actually is pretty important. And understanding how it works and what it really reflects, I think, can help us all deal rationally with the situation we're in. So let's start from the beginning. The first axis is the number of infections, right? Not the number of deaths, not the number of recoveries, the number of infections going on in the defined population. The next axis is the time since the first infection. in that population. Okay, pretty straightforward, I hope. I think this is probably what you thought those axes were. The next important line is this one here. This dotted line that people are always worrying about. And the reason we're worrying about it is because of what happens here. When an infection comes into a population, the usual way that it progresses is like this curve that we've all seen. This is the bad curve, bad curve. And this, this is the good curve. This is the curve we want. Why? Let's start again. Here we are. And just to be clear, the dotted line isn't the number of hospitals that are available. It isn't the number of respirators that are available. It's the critical care capacity in all of the hospitals in each community to deal with a critically ill patient for 2 to 3 weeks, which is the amount of time that a critically ill person with COVID usually stays in hospital, provided they recover. So about 2 to 3 weeks capacity of keeping someone alive, which means having the staffing and the life support equipment there. And those are both really important things. That means 24-hour staffing. And that means life support equipment that includes some really technical things that have names that people are throwing around without really understanding them. For instance, I've heard a few stories lately about people misunderstanding what a respirator is. When they talk about the respirators used in treating someone with a bad infection in their lungs, a bad case of pneumonia because of COVID, they're not talking about the kind of respirators that are the masks that people are wearing. Some people are calling some of the fancier masks respirators. And they're not talking about those anti-snoring oxygen feed devices, the really subtle ones or the really obvious Darth Vader ones. They're not talking about that. The respirators that they're talking about when they talk about this are the kind that involve intubation. That means that they actually have to put a tube down into your lungs to feed oxygen to them because you can't breathe on your own. It's the machine that replaced the old iron lung that tried to do that by changing pressure around your rib cage to make your lungs force air in. This is a more efficient, less bulky version of that that's usually much better, but you do have to have a tube going down into your lungs for it to work, which implies all kinds of things about sterile environments and the ability of staff to work with you. It also, of course, implies that you're unconscious at the time. So just to be clear, that's what that dotted line means. Now, this line here, the first curve, the bad curve, the one that we're all trying to avoid, let's talk a bit about that. That's the infection rate if there's no mitigation. So if nothing controls it, if nothing else limits it, that's the infection rate. And it's important to understand that the shape of that curve is just meant to reflect an exponential relationship. Now, exponential is totally unlike how most people naturally think of how things progress or how we count. The usual thing we think is a linear relationship in things. So if you have one case one day and then you go to the next day, you'll probably have 2 cases. If it's grown, it'll grow from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3 and from 3 to 4 and so on like that. That's a linear relationship. And that would look like a sort of a straight arrow that maybe in that amount of time would get to the dotted line. But that's not how living things spread. If a living thing has no predators and lots of food, they tend to grow exponentially. And exponentially just means that over a set period of time, instead of going up other kinds of ticks of measurement, it doubles. So whereas I said before, 1, 2, 3, 4, here it would be 1, 2, 4, 8, which means that in 10 steps or over 10 units of time, instead of getting to 10, we go over 1,000. So exponential is really vastly, vastly faster than linear. And we might have to take a moment to try to get that through our heads. It is really important. The other thing to remember is that the shape of the curve is also going to be defined by how quickly it's doubling. And we're going to come back to that later. So then the nice curve, well, what does the nice curve mean? The nice curve is that very same infection rate if it's been slowed down by things that limit the number of people who can get the disease or the ability of the disease to spread. And the way we do that is what we've all been practicing, physical distancing, so that the disease can't get from one person to the other directly from body to body. When infected people wear masks out in public, they're limiting the distance even more, because if they cough or sneeze, the virus can go much further than just 6 feet, as we're learning now, and it can hang in the air for a long time. So getting them to wear masks to protect the non-infected people, that's really important. Or just getting them to stay home, which means that staying home is what you do to protect yourself and the people you care about. And finally, hand washing. Hand washing, we are so lucky this works. And it's kind of cool how well it works. If you're worried about how to kill this virus has a fat membrane around it. Its outer skin is made up of lipids or fats. And soap breaks down fats. That's what soap is designed to do. Soap breaks down fats so that the fats can then carry dirt away when you wash the soap off. So hand washing is just the perfect way to deal with this, as long as you can do it often enough. And it's those three things really that will cause a curve to flatten. So just to be clear, that's what that model means. But exponential, to come back to that, that's just a worrisome term, like I said, because the question is, at what rate is it doubling? And now for a scary story, I want to talk to you about the Cairns cluster. The Cairns cluster is what they're calling the initial spread of COVID-19 in Newfoundland, where my sister and her children live. In Newfoundland, there were no cases at all that were known. Certainly none in the city of St. John's, which is the biggest city there. And then something happened. A popular funeral home on the 13th, yes, the 13th of March, popular funeral home was hosting a funeral and a wake, and the wake went on for 3 days. And during that time, two very different intersecting crowds overlapped in the funeral home. And they did what you do at funerals before social distancing. They comforted each other, they shared food and stories. They didn't worry about touching the same doorknobs, using the same bathrooms, or even signing the memories book with the same pen. It ends up that one woman went to the funeral with what she thought was a bit of a persistent cold. And she infected somewhere more than 100 people, maybe 150 people in those 2 days, or 3 days. So that's not the usual way we think about exponential growth either. In one family that was attending that funeral, 25 people ended up sick. A week after the funeral and wake, Newfoundland had its first death from COVID. And a week later, that gentleman's wife succumbed as well. Now, why am I telling you a horror story about Newfoundland? Well, in part to scare you a little bit about how things spread. There's been a lot of talk on the news about how one person infects two and then those two people infect four. No. One person can infect many more than that. The other reason I'm talking about this is because Newfoundland is an island with a restricted travel innate to its nature. And islands can show us a lot about how a virus spreads and about how it can be wiped out. And again, that's something to talk about a little later. First, I just wanted to ask, it's plague times, it's isolation times, and I hear everybody's doing all kinds of baking. And I want to talk to you about something from the perspective of baking. I love baking. And I'd like to discuss with you the mental model of what's going on when you're baking bread. I've been baking a long time. I learned to bake as a child. And when I make bread, I tend to make it by feel. It's one of only a few things in baking that I do by feel instead of by strict measurement. I imagine many of you are the same. So my mental model of making bread is pretty loosey-goosey. It's pretty flexible, depending on how things feel and smell and look. Most people, when they make bread, they go through a checklist. And they have the checklist of the mise en place, as the French say, the things to prepare to use when you're cooking. And then they have the checklist for the recipe to follow. Now, you could consider those to be team checklists for making bread. One group of people is putting all the ingredients together. Another group of people is following the directions for what to do next. And the team checklists for making bread only work if both teams follow their checklist completely, right? If you're supposed to have set aside yeast in doing the mise en place and you haven't done that, then the person doing the next bit of work can't start until somebody gets some yeast and gets it soaking in water and gets it to the point where it's grown enough that it can be useful. Otherwise, you're making matzah, and that's a whole other story. Now, just to be clear, both teams have to follow the checklist completely, or whichever team didn't do something has to say so right away so that the next folks can adjust their behavior. Like I said, if there's no yeast around and no time to let the stuff rise and you want to make bread and you're all there and the oven's ready and you've got the other ingredients, adjust your behavior, change your checklist, switch to the checklist for making unleavened bread. Why not? It's an easy solution. If you don't recognize that something has changed and adjust your behavior accordingly, then there will be a disaster. You'll shape out beautiful French sticks, expecting it to be wonderful, looking forward to tasting it, wondering maybe why it's only half the size of the last time you made it. And when you bake them, you end up with, well, maybe a baton or a play sword, certainly not bread you'd want to eat. Now, the usual way to look at this is that disaster strikes in these sequential situations. Disaster strikes only if the other guys screw up. For one thing, because it can't possibly be my fault. And for another thing, because that guy who was just talking said that it's sequential. I'm not going to make a mistake, so it must be the other guys screwing up. But remember, it's also if we don't adjust our behavior accordingly. That's really important. And I think it's obvious. I hope it is from what I've said. So just to be clear, the first screw up is not admitting failure. And the second screw up is sticking with an outdated mental model. Which brings us back to this mental model of what is it to flatten the curve. Let's provide some new information into that model and take a look at it again. And the new information is this question: do we have enough tests in this country? Because it's something that people were talking about a lot before. So let's take a look at this model again with that in mind, right? We've got the number of infections and the time since the first infection, right? We've got that in place. Then we've got the line that we talked about before, the capacity, and we've got that first curve, right? And we've got the second curve, the one we're trying to get through by doing the social distancing, by washing our hands, by getting people to wear masks or stay at home. All of that is intended to turn one blue curve into a different blue curve, the unfriendly blue curve where the system is overwhelmed, to the friendly blue curve where just as many people get sick, but not so quickly that it overwhelms our medical resources or medical staff, right? Pretty straightforward. We've talked about that. Everybody, I hope, is clear on it. Here's the thing. That purple square shows us where those strategies work. Those strategies work when you're trying to affect the curve before it gets past your capacity to safely treat everybody, right? That's of key importance. Going past your capacity to safely treat everybody, going over above the curve here in the dark blue line, that's when you get to what Italy was having to do, the doctors in Italy a month ago, when they were having to decide, okay, I've got more critically ill patients than ventilators. We have to come up with a triage system for ranking which ones we try to save. That's what we're trying to avoid. And that strategy works for that, as we've discussed. But here's the thing, there's another line in the diagram. That other line comes from the data we just talked about. So let's look at it again, right? In the time since the first infection, how many number of infections have we detected before we ran out of tests? Because when we don't have the capacity to test anymore, that curve stops going up, not because the curve is being flattened by our behaviors, and not because the disease is dying out, but because it's impossible for us to detect anymore. Which means that the curve is actually continuing on its projected path. Which means that we are actually somewhere above that now. Maybe not to the point where the hospitals are overwhelmed, but we're on that path. So the question becomes, what rate is it changing at? How quickly is it changing? What strategies should we use? Well, the strategies we're currently using are good strategies if we get everybody to follow them. And the fact that we're further up the curve than we thought, that just means that we have to be more diligent and wait longer for things to resolve using the strategies we have. But the strategies will work. Social isolation or physical distancing. Masks if you may be infected. Not going out if you have any option at all. And I really just had to get out of the house because the kids are driving me crazy. Boy, think about it carefully. Be careful when you go out. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying be careful. Like I said, islands can show us how a virus can spread and how it can be wiped out. So I want to talk to you about New Zealand for just a moment. Because New Zealand put on ridiculously restrictive regulations on, I think, a 4-point scale. And they just went completely over the top, according to every critic in their government, in their society, and elsewhere. They went completely over the top, being way more restricted than they have to be, before they even had a case. But the result is that they've recently managed to declare themselves free of new infections. It came, it surged as much as it could, but because people weren't exposed to each other, the virus couldn't spread. And right now, it looks as though the virus has died off there, which is pretty amazing. It can happen in the best of cases. It can also happen in the worst of cases. The important thing is to think about which one you are. Now, like I said before, and like I always say, our emotional brains are in charge most of the time. And all of us want to go outside, and all of us want to see our friends, and all of us want to get back to doing normal things. But it would be so dangerous to do that now. Hopefully this information will help you see that. Hopefully it will help you update your mental models to see why it is we have to keep practicing so carefully these skills that we've learned, and why it is unsafe right now to become lax in practicing them. As I said last week, if you'd like to think about this with the thoughtful part of your brain and try to keep your mental models updated, then I encourage you to do so with friends, with family, on your own. And if I can help in any way, please let me know. If you're looking for data like this, I suggest that you check out this site, covidtracking.com. It's a fantastic resource that's providing the information to the public that really the government should be providing about testing, about cases, about deaths, about recoveries. That's it for the presentation now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and let's see if people would like to chat about this for a while. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see y'all again soon.